Richard E. Byrd, first to blaze an air route to the North Pole, prepares for a similar flight over the bottom of the Earth.
He was 97 years old when he finally decided the silence had lasted long enough. For nearly 8 decades, Walter Clemens had kept his word. He had never spoken to journalists. He had never attended the reunions where veterans swapped stories over warm beers. He had never corrected the official history books, even when he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been there, that those books were missing the most important chapters. He had made a promise in the winter of 1947, in a freezing communications tent at the bottom of the world, and he had kept it longer than most men keep anything. But time has a way of dissolving old loyalties. The officers who had warned him to stay silent were long dead. The government agencies that had classified what he witnessed had been reorganized, renamed, and reorganized again. And the world, Clemens had decided, deserved to know what he had seen beneath the Antarctic ice. "Before I die," he told the small research team that gathered in his Tennessee home in the spring of 2024, "I need to tell you the truth." What followed was 4 hours of testimony, calm, methodical, and deeply unsettling. To understand what Walter Clemens witnessed, you first have to understand the man who led him there. Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr. was not simply an explorer. By the mid-1940s, he was arguably the most celebrated military officer in American history who had never fought a conventional war. He had flown over the North Pole in 1926, receiving the Medal of Honor for the achievement. He had established the first American permanent outpost on the Antarctic continent, a small collection of huts and equipment he called Little America, during his 1928 expedition. He had spent 5 months alone in a remote weather station during the brutal Antarctic winter of 1934, surviving carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove and emerging with the kind of haunted calm that belongs to men who have stared at death and decided it wasn't ready for them yet. What the public knew about Byrd was the heroic version, the jaw-set aviator, the flag-planting patriot, the man who turned polar ice into American territory by sheer force of will. What the public did not know, what could not be printed in the newspapers of the era, was that by 1946, Byrd had become deeply troubled. People who worked closely with him in the final years of World War II described a man wrestling with something he could not name in polite company. His diaries from that period, portions of which have since been reviewed by historians, contain references to discoveries that reorient everything and responsibilities too large for one man's conscience. Clemens met Byrd in the autumn of 1946, during the pre-deployment staging for what the Navy was calling Operation High Jump. He was 22 years old, recently discharged from a communications unit in the Pacific Theater, and had been quietly recruited through a naval intelligence contact who told him only that the mission required men who were disciplined, discreet, and capable of operating without full information. The last phrase, Clemens said, should have been his first warning. The official record of Operation High Jump is not hard to find. It launched in late 1946 under the command of Admiral Byrd and Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen. The Navy assembled a task force of 13 ships, including the flagship USS Mount Olympus, the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, and a submarine. Approximately 4,700 men participated. The stated objectives were to establish a base of operations in Antarctica, test cold-weather military equipment, consolidate American territorial claims, and conduct aerial mapping of the continent's coastline. It was, on paper, a scientific and logistical exercise. But Clemens, who served as a communications specialist aboard one of the support vessels before being transferred to a ground unit, said the atmosphere aboard the fleet bore almost no resemblance to a research expedition. The weapons load was wrong for a science mission, he recalled, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had spent 80 years thinking about how to say this correctly. We had armaments that had no purpose in a mapping survey. Depth charges. Certain ordnance loads on the aircraft that you don't bring along to take photographs of glacier. I noticed it the first week. Other men noticed it too, but you learned quickly not to ask about it directly. The fleet reached Antarctic waters in late December 1946. Almost immediately, Clemens said, the operation divided itself into 2 distinct tracks. The first was the public-facing mission, flights photographing the coastline, meteorological data collection, base construction at a site near the Ross Ice Shelf. These activities were documented, reported on, and eventually published in declassified naval records that anyone can read today. The second track was different. Certain aircraft departed on missions not listed on the day's official flight schedule. Certain ground teams received orders through personal communication rather than written command. Clemens was assigned to one of these secondary tracks roughly 3 weeks into the operation, transferred from his communications role to a small unit that he was told was performing geological reconnaissance in the interior. He was not told what they were looking for. He would find out. The flight inland took approximately 90 minutes. Clemens remembered the landscape below as a nearly featureless white expanse, broken only by the dark ridgelines of the Transantarctic Mountains on the horizon, a chain of peaks that geologists have studied for decades, notable for their exposed rock faces and the ancient geological stories written in their strata. What he was not prepared for was what he found when the aircraft descended toward their designated landing coordinates. There was a thermal anomaly, he said, using the technical language deliberately, as though precision might make the memory more believable. A significant one. You could see it from the air, the snow pattern was wrong. In certain zones, it had melted and refrozen in ways that suggested sustained heat coming from below. Not a volcano. Not geothermal venting, which we knew about. Something more regular. More consistent. The ground team, 8 men in total, led by a lieutenant whose name Clemens declined to share, citing surviving family members, established a perimeter around one of these thermal zones and began taking readings. The temperature differential between the anomalous area and the surrounding ice was, by Clemens' recollection, somewhere between 12 and 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In Antarctic terms, that is an enormous discrepancy. What the ground team found at the center of the thermal zone was a structure. Or, more precisely, the top of a structure. The ice in that area had thinned to a degree where the shape beneath was partially visible. Geometric angles, what appeared to be a flat roof or platform, dark material that did not reflect light the way exposed rock would. The lieutenant ordered conservative probing of the ice surface, and within an hour, the team had established that the structure was large, rectangular, and positioned at a depth of roughly 40 feet below the current ice surface. No one said anything for a long time, Clemens recalled. We just stood there. You have to understand, in 1947, the understanding was that Antarctica had been uninhabited for its entire history. What we were looking at was impossible by every framework we had been given. Clemens was the unit's communications and equipment specialist, which meant that when the lieutenant ordered full instrument readings, Clemens was the man holding most of them. The magnetometer readings were, in his words, completely incoherent. The device, standard military issue for geological survey work, was cycling through readings that suggested an intense, localized magnetic field emanating from below. This was not consistent with any natural mineral deposit the team could identify. The field was not uniform, which would suggest magnetite or similar ferrous deposits. It was patterned, varying in intensity in what Clemens described as almost rhythmic intervals. I recorded everything, he said. Every reading, every timestamp. That was my job. Those records were collected from me within 48 hours and I never saw them again. Radio communications from the site were severely degraded. Clemens spent considerable time attempting to reach the base ship and experienced what he described as a lead interference, not simple static, but something that seemed to suppress transmission specifically rather than corrupting it broadly. A test signal sent on a frequency not used for voice communication went through clearly. Voice transmissions on standard naval frequencies were blocked. The most striking instrument reading, however, was one that Clemens had never encountered before and has never been able to fully explain in the decades since. The team carried a basic radiation detection instrument, a precaution standard to many post-war military operations given the nuclear tests that had recently been conducted. In the center of the thermal anomaly, directly above the point where the structure was most clearly visible, the instrument registered a reading that was not dangerous by any threshold, but was measurably elevated, and, more strangely, was oscillating in a pattern that Clemens described as resembling a signal rather than passive emission. I was 22 years old, he said. I didn't know what to make of it. Neither did anyone else. The lieutenant told us to keep recording and keep quiet. The ground team spent 2 full days at the site. On the morning of the 3rd day, a separate aircraft arrived, unscheduled, carrying 2 officers Clemens had not previously encountered. They wore standard naval uniforms with no unit insignia that Clemens recognized. The 2 officers conducted their own examination of the site, took photographs with equipment more sophisticated than what the ground team carried, and spoke privately with the lieutenant for approximately 30 minutes. Then they departed. 4 hours later, the ground team received extraction orders. They were told the mission was complete and to prepare for immediate airlift back to the main base. No one asked us to write a report, Clemens said. No one collected our field notes through any official process. An officer came around, individually, and asked each man to surrender any personal notes or recordings they had made. It was phrased as a request. It did not feel optional. Upon return to the main operational base, the men of the ground team were informally but clearly separated. They were assigned to different duties on different vessels. There was no debrief as a unit. Clemens attempted, once, to ask the lieutenant a question about what they had found, and received a response that ended the inquiry completely. That question was answered before you asked it. Don't ask it again. Clemens did not speak directly with Admiral Byrd during the bulk of the operation. He was too junior, and the command structure kept most enlisted and lower-grade officers at considerable distance from the Admiral's immediate circle. But in the final week before the operation's abrupt conclusion, high jump ended in late February 1947, roughly 8 weeks into what had been planned as a 6 to 8 month mission. Clemens had one brief, direct encounter with Byrd that has stayed with him ever since. He was alone in a passageway aboard the command ship, reviewing communications logs, when Byrd passed through with a single aide. The Admiral stopped. He looked at Clemens for a moment with the expression of a man recognizing something, not a person, exactly, but a category of person. Someone who had been to a particular place. He asked me where I'd been deployed, Clemens said. Interior survey. I told him the coordinates. Not the ones on the official record, the real ones. He nodded like that confirmed something. Byrd said 4 sentences to him. Clemens has repeated them so many times in the decades since, turning them over like stones in his memory, that he can recite them without pause. He said, "What you found out there is older than any civilization we have a name for. It was there before the ice. The ice covered it, and it waited. What you need to decide is whether knowing that makes you a better man or a more frightened one." Then he walked away.